A century ago, a professor in South Africa looked at a small fossilized skull and reached a conclusion that would eventually reshape the entire field of human origins. He was right. Almost immediately, nearly the whole of the scientific world told him he was wrong, and it would take nearly 30 years, a scandal, and a fraud exposed on another continent before anyone with real influence admitted he'd been correct from the very start. This is the story of the Taung Child, discovered in 1924, and the strange, uncomfortable truth that being right in science doesn't always mean being believed. Long before any of that controversy began, though, there was simply a child. She lived roughly 2.8 million years ago in what's now South Africa, moving through open woodland dotted with grass and scattered trees, part of a small population belonging to a species we'd later call Australopithecus africanus, not quite ape, not quite human, but something genuinely in between. She never knew any of what her remains would eventually set in motion. She was simply alive, then she wasn't, and her small skull settled into limestone sediment for nearly 3 million years, waiting. What happened next involves dynamite, a university lecture hall an ocean away, a jealous scientific establishment clinging to the wrong answer, and one of the most notorious frauds in the history of science. All of it starts with a quarry blast that was never meant to find anything important at all. The place was called Taung, a small town on the edge of South Africa's interior, and the site was an active limestone quarry run by a company blasting rock for industrial lime production. Workers there routinely uncovered animal fossils encased in the stone, and by 1924, this had become such a regular occurrence that interesting specimens were sometimes set aside and eventually passed along to nearby universities. One of these fossils, a baboon skull, caught the attention of a student at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, who brought it to the notice of her anatomy professor, a 31-year-old Australian named Raymond Dart. Dart, already chair of his department despite his youth, requested that any further interesting material from the same quarry be sent his way, mostly, by his own account, hoping for useful teaching specimens rather than expecting anything extraordinary. When a crate of rock fragments eventually arrived at his office, he began sorting through it with only mild curiosity. Then one particular fragment stopped him cold, a natural stone impression of a brain, paired with a matching piece of rock that seemed to contain an actual skull. Working late into the evenings, using little more than sharpened tools improvised from whatever was available, Dart spent weeks painstakingly freeing the fossil from its stone casing, patient, careful work, chipping millimeter by millimeter toward whatever lay hidden inside. What eventually emerged stopped him again, this time far more seriously. A small, delicate face. Wide-set eye sockets. Baby teeth still sitting in their sockets, alongside emerging adult teeth just beginning to push through, the unmistakable signature of a young child, roughly 3 years old at the time of death. But the details underneath were what mattered most. The opening at the base of the skull, where the spinal cord connects to the brain, sat positioned much further forward than it does in any modern ape, nearly where it sits in a human skull, a strong physical signal of an upright, bipedal posture rather than a hunched, knuckle-walking gait. And the brain itself, reconstructed from that natural stone impression, was larger relative to body size than any chimpanzee's, though still considerably smaller than a modern human's. Dart understood almost immediately what he might be holding, not simply another fossil ape, but something occupying genuinely intermediate territory between the two, walking upright well before the brain had caught up in size. Within roughly 40 days of receiving the crate, working with an urgency that bordered on obsession, Dart completed a full scientific paper, naming this new find Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa, and sent his manuscript overseas to be published in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The paper appeared in February 1925, and it made an enormous claim for its time, that this small, ape-like child represented a genuine transitional form between humanity's ancient ancestors and ourselves, and that it had been found not in Europe, not in Asia, but in Africa. For most of the leading scientific figures of the era, that second detail landed almost as hard as the first. The dominant assumption throughout the early 20th century held that human origins traced back to Europe or Asia, a belief tangled up with the era's colonial worldview, which struggled to accept that the earliest chapters of human history might have unfolded on the African continent. Layered on top of that resistance sat a second, more purely scientific obstacle. Decades earlier, a skull unearthed in England, now known to be an elaborate fraud, though nobody suspected that yet, had convinced much of the field that large brains evolved before upright walking, not after. That fraudulent specimen, still treated as genuine, seemed to directly contradict everything Dart's Taung fossil suggested. Add to this a completely reasonable scientific caution: juvenile skeletons of any species can look deceptively different from adults of the same species, making species identification from a single child's skull a genuinely difficult, uncertain business. Between outdated geography, a convincing fraud, and legitimate methodological doubt, Dart's paper landed to immediate, widespread skepticism. The rejection wasn't gentle. Senior figures across European anatomy dismissed the find outright, some suggesting it was simply an unusual juvenile ape with no meaningful connection to human ancestry at all. Letters arrived at Dart's Johannesburg office questioning his methods, his conclusions, and at times his basic competence. For a young academic still building his reputation, this kind of coordinated pushback from established authorities carried real professional risk. And unlike a modern researcher who might quickly gather more supporting evidence, Dart had almost nothing else to point to, one child's skull, alone, standing against the collective weight of Europe's scientific establishment. He continued teaching his classes in Johannesburg, continued his ordinary academic responsibilities, and largely stepped back from actively championing his own discovery in the years that followed, worn down by resistance he had little means of overcoming on his own. The fossil itself remained carefully preserved in his university office, correct and unproven all at once, while the broader field moved on with barely a backward glance. For over a decade, that might have been where the story ended, a promising young scientist's boldest claim, quietly shelved and gradually forgotten. What eventually changed the story wasn't Dart himself, but a Scottish-South African physician and fossil hunter named Robert Broom. Working through the 1930s at a site called Sterkfontein, not far from Johannesburg, Broom began deliberately searching for exactly the kind of evidence Dart's critics claimed was missing: adult specimens of the same species, which would settle the juvenile uncertainty problem once and for all. And he found them. Over the following years, Broom recovered adult Australopithecus africanus fossils showing the same distinctive combination of traits Dart had originally described: upright posture paired with a still modest brain size, this time from individuals whose adult anatomy left far less room for doubt. Each new specimen strengthened the case incrementally, chipping away at the scientific establishment's confidence in its own dismissal. Word of these growing discoveries eventually reached Dart directly, and by most accounts, it marked the first real sense of vindication he'd experienced in over a decade of quiet, largely unacknowledged correctness. The tide was beginning to turn, slowly, fossil by painstaking fossil, from a hillside outside Johannesburg that would go on to become one of the most important paleontological sites on the entire planet. The final, decisive blow to the old resistance came from an entirely unexpected direction. In 1953, nearly 3 decades after Dart's original paper, that supposedly contradictory English skull, the one that had convinced a generation of scientists that large brains evolved first, was subjected to new chemical testing. The results were unambiguous: it was a fraud, deliberately assembled decades earlier from a modern human skull combined with an altered ape jawbone, and it had fooled much of the scientific establishment for over 40 years. With that fabricated evidence finally removed from the picture, and with Broom steadily accumulating Sterkfontein fossils providing exactly the adult confirmation critics had demanded, the case against Dart's original interpretation simply collapsed. Within a remarkably short span, the very same scientific community that had dismissed him in 1925 began treating his conclusion as established fact. Dart, still very much alive and working, lived to witness his once ridiculed theory become the accepted foundation of an entire field, a genuinely rare outcome for any scientist whose original claim faced this level of sustained, authoritative rejection. There's a part of this story that doesn't get told nearly as often, and it's worth pausing on directly. The Taung fossil wasn't found by any scientist at all. It was found by South African quarry laborers, doing dangerous, difficult work blasting rock for industrial lime production, whose names were rarely recorded and are largely lost to history. Their labor made the entire discovery possible, and for decades, the story was told almost exclusively as Raymond Dart's achievement alone. The 100th anniversary of this discovery has become an occasion for the field to sit with that imbalance honestly, acknowledging both the genuine scientific breakthrough Dart contributed and the colonial-era context surrounding whose hands actually recovered the fossil, and whose names history chose to remember. It's a more complete version of the story than the one usually told, and arguably a more honest one. 100 years later, the field this discovery helped build looks meaningfully different than it did in 1924. Paleoanthropology was once dominated almost entirely by European researchers working from a set of deeply Eurocentric assumptions about where human history could have unfolded. Today, a growing number of African researchers, including many South Africans, lead major excavations and interpretive work across the very sites this story touches, Taung, Sterkfontein, and beyond. Women, largely absent from the field's earliest decades, now make up a substantial share of active researchers as well. None of this undoes the difficulty of Dart's original 30-year wait, or restores the names of the quarry workers whose discovery started everything. But it does mean the anniversary isn't simply a celebration of one scientist's eventual vindication, it's an occasion to recognize how much the entire discipline has shifted since a small skull first emerged from South African limestone. So here's the strange shape of this particular story. A 3-year-old child, dead for nearly 3 million years, ends up at the center of one of the most contested scientific arguments of the 20th century, not because her discovery was flawed, but because the world receiving it wasn't ready to accept where she came from. Being correct turned out to be nowhere near enough on its own. It took 30 years, a scandal exposed on another continent entirely, and a second generation of fossils dug from a hillside near Sterkfontein before the argument was finally, fully settled. Which part of this story sits with you the longest? That Dart was right from his very first paper and still had to wait 3 decades to be believed, that a proven fraud helped delay the truth for years, or that the workers who actually found the fossil were barely remembered at all? Drop your answer below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the discoveries that took the world far too long to accept.